welcome His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. His Excellency Paul Kagame, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to this lecture addressed by His Excellency. It gives me great pleasure to invite the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, to deliver his welcome address. Professor Mahbubani, please.
Your Excellency, Mr. Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome President Paul Kagame to this public lecture hosted by the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. Indeed, President Kagame has done us a great honor by accepting our invitation today, and we thank you for this, President. Let me begin by saying that Singaporeans are, of course, familiar with the story of a small nation that began its history with unpromising beginnings. Indeed, the history began with ethnic riots and political instability in its early years. And in the early years, at that time, this small country was almost written off by the international community, and many of them said that this small country was doomed to failure. Fortunately, good leaders emerged and the country was saved, and indeed that small country has begun to grow and prosper. Now, the small country I'm talking about is, of course, Singapore. However, the words that I use could also apply to Rwanda. Unlike Singapore, Rwanda has experienced even more unpromising beginnings. Indeed, in the year 1994, it experienced one of the worst genocides in human history. Almost 800,000 people were killed, many of them with machetes. And after this genocide, few thought that Rwanda could succeed or prosper. But it has. The Rwanda genocide has, of course, seared the conscience of the international community. Many leading members of the international community have been deeply troubled by what happened there. Both Bill Clinton and Kofi Annan have publicly apologized for their failure to intervene and prevent the genocide. And when Singapore was a member of the Security Council, I remember personally telling the Security Council that if Bill Clinton and Kofi Annan could apologize, why could the Security Council not do so, since the Security Council had also failed in its responsibility to protect the people of Rwanda. Unfortunately, the UN Security Council does not believe in accountability and refused to do so. But fortunately for Rwanda, this failure of the international community has been more than overcome by the remarkable leadership that President Kagame has provided to Rwanda. His life story is a remarkable one. He was born in the western Rwanda region of Gitarama in 1957. He left with his family for Uganda 4 years later amid growing anti-Tutsi violence in his home region. And for most of his adult life, he has been a soldier. And under his military leadership, the Rwandan Patriotic Front assumed power in the year 1994, and President Kagame assumed the presidency in April 2000. And this soldier has proven himself to be a very good manager of the economy too, and under his leadership, the Rwandan economy has indeed done well. As recently as March this year, an IMF delegation went to Rwanda and reported that Rwanda's economy has continued to perform well. Despite a cyclical weakening in agriculture, economic growth reached 6%. What's also remarkable is that President Kagame strongly believes in self-reliance. In an interview with Time magazine in September last year, he said, and I quote, "The donors have also made lots of mistakes. Many times they have assumed that they are the ones who know what countries in Africa need. They want to be the ones to choose where to put this money, to be the ones to run it without any accountability. In other cases, they have simply associated with the wrong people and money gets lost and ends up in people's pockets. We should correct that," unquote. And it's remarkable for him to be so critical of the donor community. But despite his candor, he continues to be widely admired around the world. Many world leaders have commented on what a dramatic transformation he has made in Rwanda. And indeed, as I was telling the President, I remember the last time I met him was at a bar in Aspen, this is true by the way, to witness a remarkable dialogue between President Bill Clinton and President Kagame during the Fortune magazine brainstorming conference. And before that, I actually had the personal privilege also of calling on President Kagame with the UN Security Council delegation in his capital city, Kigali, which I remember well as a truly beautiful city. And if I can make a small tourist plug, I encourage all of you to visit Kigali too. Now, in addition to President Bill Clinton, other world leaders have also praised President Kagame. Tony Blair has said, and I quote, "I have great admiration for President Kagame's leadership and for what he has done to help Rwanda stabilize and rebuild itself." President George W. Bush has said, and I quote, "The President, he's a man of action. He can get things done." And he said, "I'm proud of your leadership." And finally, we of course have to end with an academic. A Harvard professor, Josh Rookson, said, and I quote, "I've worked in 50 countries, and I think that this is the only country on the planet that stands the chance of migrating from extreme poverty to middle income in the space of the next 15 years. In short, we are truly privileged to have President Kagame address us today. I hope you'll join me now in welcoming President Kagame to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kishore, Dean of the School of Public Policy, students and faculty, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm very much delighted to be here with you this evening and thank the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for the invitation to share some thoughts on how Africa and Rwanda are making the transition from crisis to development. I also look forward to discussing some of the questions you may have on the topic later on. I want to argue that the perception of Africa as a continent in perpetual crisis and an investment and friendly place, famously declared by The Economist magazine in March 2000 as the hopeless continent, in quotes, is no longer in keeping with reality. The same is true for my country, Rwanda, which in the last 14 years has moved beyond a difficult past and is pursuing our vision of a reconciled, united, and prosperous nation. Despite occasional tensions and isolated conflict hotspots in parts of our continent, there can be no doubt that Africa and Rwanda have undergone profound changes in the past decade, with greatly improved prospects for economic growth and development. Mr. Chairman, before going into greater detail on contemporary Africa, it is useful to provide a historical context that explains why our continent fell behind. I will begin with the well-known fact that most of Africa was notoriously ill-equipped at independence to conceive and implement an effective development agenda, a shortcoming that saw the continent drift from crisis to crisis. With a few exceptions, both state and non-state actors, especially the private sector, were grossly underdeveloped at the end of the colonial era. The problem stemmed from a combination of factors. These included weak or non-existent institutions and limited technical capacity and competence, a consequence of the absence of a critical mass of professionals. The subsequent years, up to the early 1990s, generally referred to as the lost decades, were characterized by stagnation or decline of almost all social and economic indicators. Even in the relatively successful cases, the developmental strategies pursued in Africa were problematic, as was the case in other countries of Latin America and Asia. By this I mean the important substitution models, the import substitution models pursued that sought to promote enterprises by using high tariff barriers as protection from international competition. This strategy promptly fell apart when international development agencies imposed structural adjustments which stipulated the removal of subsidies to industry. In the case of Rwanda, not only was the country adrift, it was led by people who championed a backward ideology based on elimination of the section of its citizenry, further complicating the socio-economic and political crisis and culminating in the genocide of 1994. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, what happened to change this old Africa in course? A number of factors during the 1980s and 1990s account for this. First of all, Africans themselves began to challenge the old order. Most military and civilian dictatorships were swept aside. Elsewhere in the world, spectacular changes were taking place that had significant impact on the African continent, including the collapse of the communist system, which had sustained many African despotic regimes supported by both sides of the Cold War. The strongest economy on the continent, South Africa, reached a negotiated settlement to end the apartheid system that had disenfranchised the largest segment of the country's society and marginalized a potential source of productive capacity and the domestic market. Finally, the technology and information revolution gained momentum in Africa, increasing the pace of globalization in the form of larger flows of foreign investment, finance, and innovation. Distinguished audience, the circumstances that I have just pointed out have combined to change Africa fundamentally, resulting in improved investment climate as illustrated by an economic growth rate averaging between 5 and 6% in the last several years. Part of the success story may be attributed to the fact that commodities which form the bulk of the continent's exports are fetching high prices in international markets. Beyond raw material exports, however, foreign direct investment to Africa has also increased steadily. For example, it doubled between 2004 and 2006 to reach 39 billion US dollars. Clearly, this share remains small, only representing a fraction of the global foreign direct investment worth 1.3 billion US dollars. Africa has to work harder to increase its share. In Rwanda, the opportunities and potential offer have begun to attract significant investment in a range of sectors including finance, energy, tourism, construction, and mining. These investments originate from United Kingdom, South Africa, Germany, United Arab Emirates, and the United States, among others. In addition, sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, venture capitalists, as well as public funds channeled to the private sector are also making their mark in Rwanda. There are other positive indicators in Africa, especially some homegrown developments. For example, financial markets on the continent are expanding, as are African-based companies using these capital markets. Consider the fact that the individual worth of the top 200 companies in Africa range between 72 billion US dollars and 375 million US dollars. Equally important is the fact that these enterprises are no longer just state monopolies or limited to industries that extract raw materials, as had been the case in the past. These companies are led by entrepreneurs and are to be found in telecommunications, financial services, construction, transportation, consumer goods and manufacturing, as well as emerging industries such as pharmaceuticals, media, entertainment, and leisure. In the case of the information and technology sector, for example, African entrepreneurs have done extremely well driving the spread of mobile phone technologies that have transformed the way of life and doing business for small African traders, formal enterprises, and governments alike. The fact that Africa is the fastest growing market for mobile phone technologies, as well as the place for the highest returns on investment, generally owes a great deal to these new economic realities. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the increased interest in Africa by Asian countries, especially China and India, is also changing the equation for the better by challenging the traditional European and North American trade and investment dominance. In the case of China, growth in trade is being fostered by, among other things, the doubling of the number of tariff-free African products following the 2006 China-Africa agreements. China is now Africa's third largest trading partner, with the trade volumes recently increasing by 30% to reach $50 billion in 2006 and expected to double by 2010. Beyond trade, Chinese investment in Africa has risen rapidly from a few million US at the beginning of the millennium to 12 billion US by 2007. The challenge in this context is that African entrepreneurs must take advantage of these new openings in order to render China-Africa trading and investment relationships a mutually beneficial two-way traffic. India, driven by its own speedy growth, is following suit, as shown by the last month's India-Africa Summit, which sought to energize economic partnership with the continent. The summit led to intent and agreements to establish preferential entry for African products into the Indian market. Particular emphasis was placed on support for agricultural development in Africa, a critical sector in which the majority of the continent's people earn a livelihood, but has led to attain its enormous, has yet to attain its enormous potential for generating wealth. Excellencies, distinguished guests, in light of these recent Asia-Africa trade and investment initiatives, I'm of the view that there has never been a better time to seize the momentum of promoting South-South cooperation that, though often talked about, has never become a reality. In the case of Rwanda, we look to countries like Singapore as inspirational development models due to the rapid pace at which you have successfully transformed your country. A 9-hour flight from Singapore gets you to Kigali in Rwanda. We are therefore not far apart geographically. However, we need to shorten the great psychological distance between our two continents and our two countries. In other words, we need to work harder to remove the negative perception that continue to conceal opportunities in Africa. We in Africa are also challenged to look east for what Asia's vibrant market economies have to offer Africa, whether in collaborative socio-economic endeavors or inspirational insights and wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by noting that Africa still faces considerable challenges as some of our recent accomplishments remain fragile. Nonetheless, we in Rwanda, in particular, continue to consolidate our reforms that aim at sustaining our hard-won socio-economic and political gains. We are convinced that private investment is the real basis for economic growth, greater prosperity, and improved lives. Success on this front certainly demands relentless and focused efforts at dispelling the misconceptions that paint our country and the continent as unfit for business. It is in this context that we are pleased to visit Singapore and engage with leaders as well as friends and colleagues in the government and business in order to develop and strengthen fruitful partnerships in areas of mutual importance. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for that address. Now the floor is going to be open for questions. I hope you'll start thinking of them while I pose to the President, if you don't mind. The first question. You know, as a Dean of a School of Public Policy, one of the most difficult jobs we have is to try and persuade many of our students who come from overseas that you can actually succeed and, you know, thrive economically. But I notice in your case, you spent most of your life as a soldier, but you went from being a good soldier to a good economist. And that's a very unusual transition. Who did you read, or what stories inspired you as you began to focus on economic development? What were the kind of things that said, hey, this is what I can do too?
Maybe to answer that, let me start the story from the beginning. In fact, right from my childhood, part of which you mentioned, I grew up as a refugee in a refugee camp for decades. I was a refugee for close to 30 years. Wow. From 60s to 90s. So before I became a soldier, there is that part of life that in itself was a training for me. Living as a stateless person, as a refugee in a refugee camp, and, you know, challenges one to think, to question a number of things, to want to understand why things are the way they are. So to speak, that life of deprivation, of injustice, in fact is what transformed me into the kind of soldier that you are talking about. Being a soldier wasn't necessarily my first choice. It was a result of that life. Because the soldier that I started being was, in fact, not so much a soldier as a fighter. I was somebody fighting for my freedom and freedom of my country. And it called for an armed struggle, which I got involved in with many other Rwandese. And I started, in fact, in Uganda, where I was as a refugee, got involved in the struggle in Uganda, then became a soldier in Uganda, meaning I was outside my country. So later on, I came to Rwanda and used that background and experience to fight for my country's liberation. So really, that's the link between the soldier and somebody managing the country today and seeking to have development in my country, and the model we chose or we look to has been shaped and informed by that kind of history, wanting to ensure that what we do uplifts the people of Rwanda, and the only way for self-dignity and respect is through prosperity, is through economic development, and therefore for that to have a meaning again, it has to have the context of ownership, and ownership for better life and the processes leading to that. So the fact that there is that history again, it tends to put value to life, to people, and in fact, later on our own country, Rwanda, which is not so much endowed in terms of what they call natural resources, even also teaches us to understand probably better than anyone that the main resource of our country, the main asset of our country, is really our people. So we have to invest in our people, we have to invest in skills, in knowledge, in formation, in innovation, and so on and so forth. So this is why our process brings us closer to Singapore and probably other cases that have some of these similarities in their background. So probably that really, otherwise to just zero it on a person I could have thought about and so on. I just wanted to start with the history first, which shapes our mind, and then in the process you are able to see cases developing meaningfully that very closely to you, and certainly I think there could not have been a better place for me to speak than at the Kuan Public Policy School.
Thank you. I hope you pass the word in other countries also. Okay, those of you who have questions, please come to the mics, please, and queue up at the mics if you don't mind. And then it's good for you to come to the mics and queue up, then I'll call on you. Please go ahead. And if you don't mind, identify yourself and give your designation. Yeah, and if you're a student of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, mention that very loudly.
Your Excellency, my name is Victor Koledoye. I'm from Nigeria, doing the Masters in Public Administration in Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
He's one of our students.
Yeah, Your Excellency, in your address, you did mention about a number of factors which is a challenge to Africa. And sorry,
speak a bit louder? Yes, go ahead.
you mentioned a lot of things which are challenges, to Africa, and one of them is the issues relating to governance and good leadership. You mentioned about the problems about despotic leaders and all the other problems that Africa have. In your own opinion, what do you think? How do you actually think that Africa can sustain, good leadership, taking the fact that Africa have a lot of human resources that can change Africa economically, but unfortunately the political situation is not allowing, good people to be able to attain political position. So what's your take on that? And the other part is, do you actually think that Africa needs democracy? You talk about following the footsteps of Singapore. Singapore evolved its own type of democracy. Don't you think that Africa have to evolve our own type of democracy so that we can actually make a headway? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, after your answers, yeah, please. Mr. President, 2 questions. How do you think Africa can sustain good governance leadership? And do you think Africa needs its own kind of democracy?
Governance, good governance, is very important, and I think experience has shown us that from east to west, north to south. Without good governance, everything will be very costly in all sorts of ways, whether it is business or running a government or administration and so on and so forth. So, good governance has good results, and that's what should be anyway. There's no argument against it. And to have good governance, you have to have leaders behind it. And leaders, again, I mean leaders at different levels. When I'm talking about leaders, I don't just confine myself to presidents, prime ministers, and others. I'm talking about leaders at different levels and leaders in different sectors, whether it is business, government, and so on and so forth. So, sustainable, that should be, indeed, because what would be the point of saying something will only happen today and not happen tomorrow, that you have identified that has to make sense. And I think Africa indeed can achieve this as anywhere else this has been achieved. But it is up to Africans, ourselves, to be able to do and put together what it takes to be able to have this leadership, because that is what we should be expected of. That's what, and certainly the people of Africa deserve to see that there is good leadership. They need to be led and governed justly and well as they overcome the different challenges of their social and economic development. So I think this is possible, and it is a matter of choice Africa has to make, like the reality has been in other places. Now, whether democracy, you see, to get this right, for Africa to shape its own type of democracy, as other places have done, starts with the point of ownership, which I talked about. And Africa put its act together so that we are able to manage ourselves. Africa certainly cannot be managed from outside forever, from the period of colonialism and then after colonialism. Africa remained remotely controlled. And of course, the biggest challenge here is that it is not mainly the fault of those who remotely control us. It's even ourselves who accept to be remotely controlled. Why should we accept it? Or most, even some of you who have just asked questions, who are here, who are studying, who are experiencing different kinds of life, should build on this. And together, Africans should be understanding that we need to own our processes and be able to move ourselves forward. So it is possible that I think in terms of democracy, there are real principles that should be respected. But when it comes to details, that's where differences come in. And the danger that we have all witnessed in Africa is that people tend to prescribe what Africans should do, whether it works or not for them. But because it works for those who make the prescriptions, then we must swallow it, we must do it. No, but for me, that is the whole essence, even that maybe links with the kind of background I talked about, liberation. Liberation means people freeing themselves and having values that they respect and other people should respect, as we should also respect other people's values. So there is nothing that fits all in terms of details for democracy. Because to be honest, I tell you, when I watch, I've been watching people who set the standards of democracy and other things when they are carrying out campaigns for, presidential campaigns and so on and so forth. When I'm watching television and seeing what is going on, sometimes you get an impression it's a question of who has more money to splash around. That so whether that is democracy in terms of detail, that is something we can debate. Yes, but as long as we're able to allow freedoms, basic freedoms to exist, I think, and to allow the principles on which democracy is founded to be there, then the details, I think, will depend on specificities of different situations.
I think we'll go to clockwise fashion. Please, you're next.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm not from the great Kuan School of Public Policy.
You're welcome to apply.
But my name is Hakim Ben Hamoud, and I was the chief economist of the UN Economic Commission for Africa until recently, and now I'm working in the WTO under the leadership of a great Rwandan lady. Mr. President, I would like first to thank you for really your presentation. I would like also to congratulate you beyond the presentation on your vision and leadership for Rwanda and for rebuilding the new Rwanda. Mr. President, I know that you are interested in Asia. You were here last year in Shanghai. You are here now. You are talking about Singapore. If in this new Africa, in this, new development in Africa, if we need to bring maybe 1 or 2 or 3 main lessons for us back home from Asian development to make sure that the new Africa is a success, what are the 3 main lessons? Is it leadership? Is it vision? Is it governance? What are, in your views, Your Excellency, the main lessons we need to bring back home for our development? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's really a combination of factors. One is the attitude, the mentality towards work. people to be able to work, to want to work. The attitude. The attitude is very important that I would bring on board. Number two, I would want to think that investing in our people, giving them skills, giving them knowledge, embracing technologies is very important. So investing in the people, in a healthy population, in educated and skilled population, building whatever we are building, our nations, based on knowledge and skills. This is very important. That's another thing I would draw from here. Then number three is entrepreneurship. There are others that you've asked me three. Let me give you those three. I could say more.
Okay.
Yes, those are very important.
Yeah, now you're going to go continue the next mic behind, please. Yes.
Your Excellency, my name is Amit. I'm from the International Relations Office at Nanyang Technological University, which is a sister university of National University of Singapore. My question to you is one of the shortcomings that observers of Africa have often repeated about Africa is the so-called big man trap that countries in Africa have found themselves in. Each of the great leaders who led the African countries to independence, the liberators, quickly became despots and failed to create durable institutions, one after another, be it Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana or President Senghor of Ivory Coast, each one of them, and more recently Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, as we're watching it unfold. Are you yourself, sir, conscious of the fact that you pretty much come very close to fitting in that bill? And if so, what is it that you are doing to strengthen the institutions in your own country so that the reforms that you have initiated and the direction that you have put Rwanda on, the course that you have put it on, continues long after you're gone? Thank you.
Very good. You asked a question and really provided the answer as well. But let me start by saying I don't feel I'm close to what you just said I'm close to. And the way to go is really what you said. That's why I'm saying you raised the question but also gave an answer. I think the answer is, and I told you a bit of my background earlier on in the question raised by Professor Extra, that probably some of us found ourselves where we are not necessarily because we chose to be there. So having, together with others, participated in the struggle and built what we built, and I happen to emerge from among other leaders, one that is serving today. I am very conscious of the fact that there is a tomorrow without me. That one I'm very conscious about. And therefore, the importance lies, and I agree with you entirely, both in theory and practice, that we have to build institutions that will outlive individuals. I believe in that wholeheartedly. But while I am there as one of the leaders or participants in the leadership of my country, I have to do the best of the job as much as I can. And constitutionally, The Constitution reflects what I'm talking about. Our Constitution provides that how leaders come to be elected, or there are processes of election, there are limits to from when they can run to when they can be able to allow continuity with other people. It is all that. The Constitution has been in place, and I intend, and until now I'm following it by the letter. So you are right, Africa needs leaders who can build systems, institutions that look way beyond their own times and their own selves. So I believe in that. I intend to do that for my country, or to work together with my countrymen and women to achieve that. So then I can say, you wait, maybe there is another time to judge me at some point. But I agree with you entirely on your assertion, and I subscribe to that. Thank you.
The lady at the corner there, please. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah. Okay, why don't you come to the mic in front then? Just run.
Good evening, Mr. President. I'd like to thank you for your entrepreneurial vision on Africa. It's the continent of my birth, and I share the pride in its development. My question is with regards to...
You have to introduce yourself.
My name is Geeta Karwani. I'm the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy's alumni. My question is specific to Rwandan politics, actually. To the office you held before you became president. You were a vice president from 1994 to 2000. The office did not exist before you and was abolished after you. I would like you to shed some light on the creation of this. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I see they're only ask difficult questions.
These are very difficult questions. Because they are going to involve me in some details maybe that we didn't discuss all along. I want you to understand that, yes, there was this vice president position. In fact, there were many other positions because when I was vice president, it was during a transition. We had a transition period that led us to the writing of a constitution, and then the constitution brought in a number of other new ideas different from what we were doing during the transition period. There used to also be the vice prime minister. There used to be a president, vice president, then a vice prime minister, and prime minister, vice prime minister, and so on and so forth. So the vice president, the vice prime minister positions are no longer there. There are many other things. The whole setup did completely change. But if I may, let me indulge just in a small detail. I don't know what it is worth. You see, actually, to create a vice president position during that transition period, when we stopped the genocide and were to create a new government, actually my party and later on other parties came to me and suggested that I should be the president. That is 1994. Actually, on a personal decision, I refused. I told them I did not want to be the president. To the point that I suggested I actually didn't even want to be in a government. In fact, at the time, I said if things could take shape, I wanted to go and study.
At the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
I'm sure I would have ended up here maybe at some point. So, but at another point, people convinced me I could not, and we could not have struggled together to that point, and when things are still difficult, and I just walk away. And I thought they made sense. It would appear like I would be running away from problems. So I stayed. So as a compromise made by those people who when I said I didn't want to become anything, I'm not bothered at all, they said no, but at least if you don't want to become president, because in my mind I had somebody I was suggesting that they should give it to, whom I thought would appeal to the country that is fractured politically and that would reconcile people and so on. And I raised the issue. I said, why don't we give it so and so? I think he's better placed and so on and so forth. They said, okay, but if you can't take the president, why don't we create a vice president? And that is how actually even the vice president came about. But unfortunately, in the end, after 6 years, the same people came back to me and said, well, the person you suggested after all has not been up to the expectation. And that the person who was there then as the president ran into problems with the parliament, and there were lots of cases, and that's another issue. So that's the detail I thought maybe.
Sure. No, that's very, very helpful.
Yes, so that's how things change. Constitutionally, anyway, when we were writing Constitution, which was put into effect in 2003, then they changed most of the things. Yeah.
Next question over here, this mic. Yeah.
Good evening, Your Excellency, President Kagame. I have two quick questions. My name is Vanessa Lee. I'm a journalist at Today newspaper in Singapore. Firstly, is it true that the Rwandan government picked Singapore to advise Rwanda on how to build a modern city and a regional service center? Could you tell?
Is it true that Rwanda is using Singapore as a model to build an urban city?
Yes.
And could you tell us more about this collaboration as well as any other bilateral collaborations, and why the Rwandan government picked Singapore? Also, you talked earlier about history and its shaping influence on your life and your country, and you are rightly acclaimed for your leadership after such a national tragedy as the genocide. Please be assured that I ask this with the utmost respect. Mr. President, being ethnically Tutsi, how did you feel about having to lead your country towards reconciliation after such a tragedy as what happened in 1994?
So the first question is, what is the collaboration between Singapore and Rwanda?
Yes.
Second question is about how did you feel about the reconciliation process?
Part of the first question, I think, was answered in terms of how we have come to look east for some of the developments that we are happy to learn from that are taking place, that we can base on some aspects of our own development. And particularly in Rwanda, one of the cases we picked on that was interesting to us was that of Singapore. I think I did mention that earlier on. And we have not just stopped at admiring it and reading books about it and so on and so forth. It was going to be more productive and useful if there was direct collaboration. And that's really what brought us close, and direct collaboration also meaning some Singaporeans of certain expertise with the agreement of the government that has been kind enough to avail itself and open doors to us. These people partnering with our people and bringing this expertise on which to build, whether it is urban planning and it is even in the management of our public services and a number of areas and skills development and so on and so forth. The different models that have been used here in Singapore have been of great interest to us, and fortunately Singapore has agreed to share these experiences and support us in such a direct way. So that is how and what we are doing with Singapore. Well, managing ethnically divided country like Rwanda and so on and so forth. First of all, one thing we have learned ourselves, and I think many people either know that or should learn it. There are people who are already exposed to that and know it. Why should, first of all, even underlying our reconciliation process, we really pose the question, why should anybody not be proud of what they are? There is no crime, there is no offense in being who you are. In Rwanda, whether you are a Hutu or Tutsi or Twa, or you want to call whatever, there is nothing wrong with that. What is wrong is to use what you are to the detriment of another that is different from you. And that is the point we try to make. We say Rwandans should feel free to be what they feel they are. But none should use it to the detriment of the other. And in the end, we should use that, bring together all that to build a nation that is of common interest to all of us. So for me, with the education and the background and experience I got from the life that I've lived, I've lived a life of injustice and prejudice, so I know how bad it is. I know, so from that, I know how good it is to be different from this, to get away from a situation of injustice and prejudice. So I don't find difficulty in managing this situation, building on that life and building on the life of the lives of other Rwandans, because they have lived this kind of life and all of them are eager to get away from it and be where they should be, and that is live a more valuable life than has been the case. So I don't find much difficulty, but there are complexities we have to manage. But fortunately, we find it a pleasure to be able to be part of that process of managing.
You know, I'm looking at my watch. We have 15 more minutes. I'm not so sure whether we can get through all the questions, but I'm still going to continue around. By this mic, I'm going to allow 2 questions, Mr. President. One from the gentleman in front, and then from the South African High Commissioner. She, as an ambassador, especially lady ambassador, she gets to cut the queue a bit. So please, go ahead. You ask the question, then Zanila, please.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Perpetual, a Ghanaian from LKY. The values you preach of placing premium on development of human resources is quite scarce on the continent of Africa. In spite of the development that is going on, there is a lot of, or largely, recklessness in quote on the part of many of our leaders on the continent. As a leader of Africa and a member of the African Union, what steps are you taking that the values you preach influence largely your colleagues in the Union? Thank you.
Values. What are the values you believe should be preached? What are the critical values?
Well,
Yes, I think I can just let you, because it is a similar question,
Sure,
if you don't mind. Your Excellency,
High Commissioner from
South African High Commissioner, I was also going to ask a question on intra-cooperation in Africa and also Africa multilateral. And I wanted to check with you as to whether you see value, do you see a homogeneous thinking in leadership in Africa? And if not, what do you think are the major challenges that face the Africa multilateral as it is trying to build the continent? Thank you.
What are the differences? Are there similarities or differences in views among the African leaders? Is that your question, Zanima?
Does His Excellency see whether there can be in the future a homogeneous kind of thought towards development in Africa amongst the African leaders?
Yeah.
And if not, what are the major challenges that you see in the Africa multilateral, even as Africa is trying to build itself up towards a meaningful player in the world?
Let me combine with
the two questions about values and about how do you see.
Yes. I think the values, just take example of the different cultures on our continent. I think what the cultures do is really to unite, to value people, value their lives, and therefore the values should be teaching us to appreciate ourselves and appreciate what is Africa. And it is up to us to look into that and see what is it that can propel us to another level in terms of development, building on that, even if it was to use knowledge and other things from elsewhere. But there is something that should be our own, and that there is our own that we should be building. That's no doubt about it. But of course, in Africa of 800 million plus, continuing in another few decades to it will be over a billion, and 53 countries. There are similarities largely on the continent that we can look at and build on. But there are also, you'll find differences because there are different tribes, cultures, and so on and so forth. So it is important that we identify what is it that we share that we can build on together, but even what is different from one country to another should be lessons for different people who are doing different things. So we can build on commonality, but we can also build on diversity, because diversity has some of these values that can be used to build nations or to build our continent or to propel us into development. So naturally there will be challenges because there are people who think differently. If it is differently and positively, this is one thing. But you might even think differently in a sense that some people are not even thinking constructively. These people also exist. So the usefulness of having an African Union, for example, or other organizations that bring together African people is to discuss problems. If we identify particular problems in one area that we can manage together, then people should come forward and give their views. This is not a very straightforward thing. It doesn't, but it is something worth always putting forward and trying to achieve, to use what is good, what is available with us to overcome certain difficulties and challenges. So it's a long process. It's not one thing that we will do and immediately get a solution. So managing diversity in Africa which can be used for the common good and building on what we share is something we need to keep focusing on, but it is not as easy because of these forces. And it is not just forces on the continent or inherent in these values of Africa and so on that may be problematic. It is also that there are external factors and forces that actually make it difficult, even for what is African and good, to be able to be put to work or to be put to good use and give results. So it's a situation that we need to manage, and that's why indeed we need good governance, that's why we need good leaders, and we cannot just create good leaders. Sometimes they evolve over time and there is no immediate remedy.
Should I go? I think we may not have time to finish all the questions, but we'll try a couple. Please, over to you now.
Yeah, my name is Chidi. I'm from Nigeria and I live and work in Singapore. And I'm a fan of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. At least the Dean will be very happy about this. First of all, Your Excellency, I want to commend your zero-level tolerance for corruption. For us, as Africans, is a major reference point. When we talk about Africa, we always use you as a role model. And for you to have come to lead a nation with a very checkered history, because I remember that after the German occupation and after the World War, Belgium occupied Rwanda and they left, and then you became independent. But recurring decimal in Rwanda is this: there's always this kind of genocide. The world only got to know about the one in 1994 because it came at a very large scale. So the question today is, what institutional framework do you have on ground to avert this kind of disaster again? Because we've had series of Hutus and Tutsis always massacring themselves. And then the other question I want to ask again borders on when you were talking about India and China. Now I look back to Africa and I see what the Western colonialists did to us. They actually raped and exploited a lot of our resources. Are we going to see that again with China? Now, because China has suddenly become a mecca for a lot of African leaders, and Africa has also become a mecca for a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs, that you even find them in remote villages in Africa. So what is your take on that?
Thank you. So the first question, about, I think you got it, about how, because the genocide preceded, it started in Belgian times and so on and so forth. What institutional frameworks do you need to put in place to prevent it from happening again? Second question, will China and India now become the new colonizers of Africa? I didn't ask that question, you did.
Let me, again it relates to some of the questions that were previously asked. You talked about fighting corruption and so on and so forth. Let me start by saying that there is nothing African about corruption, to do with corruption. First of all, I want to dismiss any notion or any misunderstanding that corruption is an African thing. No. So
we have some in Asia also.
Even in Europe, in America, everywhere it's corruption. In fact, even corruption that takes place in Africa, you find different races and tribes and religions involved from all over the world. So, corruption is bad. It just needs to be fought against and eradicated. It's bad for governance, it's bad for everything, for the economy, for business. So it's a bad man. So, in fact, it is not one of those values, therefore, Africa has in its culture. In the culture of Africans, people even respect themselves. They respect you. So that is one. Secondly, this genocide you mentioned, genocide came as a result of an ideology. It's ideological. And one could ask, why did it take place in Rwanda where you only have, actually Rwandans are one, even though you talk about Tutsis and Hutus and Twas and you think, but even then you are only talking about 3 groups in one country. There are countries that have hundreds of tribes, and yet you may not necessarily have as much chaos as you had with Rwanda with only 3 groups that otherwise are also identical. So, but it has a lot to do with a colonial system of divide and rule. In fact, in the early 1930s in Rwanda, when the Belgians took over Rwanda, by the way, it was first the Germans, and then the UN handed it over to, so Rwanda was just being traded like, you know, it was, they gave it to whoever wanted it. It was Germans, then say, oh, Germans, maybe you have a lot on your hands, let's give this Rwanda to somebody else. So they transferred us to other people's hands. And in the 1930s, one of the things that was instituted in Rwanda was to provide identity cards. In 1930s, which identity cards would describe whether you are a Hutu or a Tutsi or a Twa. And that was mediated to decide how you will be treated. Whether you go to school or you have business, what type of business or what type of school, and so on and so forth. So discrimination was radicalized as way back and institutionalized and so on. So the way to reverse all this is through a better ideology, politics of valuing people, of valuing nationals equally. So what one needs to do, therefore, and as we are doing earlier on, we talked about building institutions, but institutions also based on valuing people equally, equitable involvement, participation as stakeholders in our country. So that's what our politics does in Rwanda today. So corruption, genocide, they are all products of bad politics and bad leaders. No question about it. Only that one is worse than the other, that's all. And genocide is worse than corruption, but politically you can get rid of that. Now, China, the most important thing that you have come to us, which is good that it comes up. China and India and others tomorrow who will merge. Yes, they are coming to Africa. They are saying the right thing when they are coming. That's fine. But before I look at China or India or Europe or America and what they have done or about to do in Africa, for me, I want to start by looking at Africa itself. You see, you cannot change things if you don't change Africa itself and the Africans themselves in their mindset, in their attitude. Because Africa and Africans must be prepared, must know what they want in relations with China or India or Europe or America. Is it fair business? Are you engaged on equal terms? Are governments or businesses representing the best of their interests? Otherwise, if Africa, like the case has been before, remains a place that is just open to be ripped off by the people who are coming in and collaborating with some Africans who are ready to represent their continent in ripping it off, then you will certainly continue with the same problem. So before I think about what is the problem of China or India or others, I really want to start by saying, what is it that we Africans should be doing to make sure that whoever comes to deal with us. But what is interesting here is, actually, Europe and America seem to be more worried about China and India in Africa than Africans are even worried about them. And I think the reasons are clear. The reasons are that probably there is suspicion that they are going to beat them at their own game. And that's why I go back to the same question, to the same issue of saying that Africa needs to step back a little bit and say, how do I deal with all this? And anyway, what is it they are interested in? And how do I leverage it for improvement of lives of the Africans? If you don't do that, if we don't do that as Africans, I imagine, let me sound like cynical in a sense. I don't think anybody owes us a living. I don't think that anybody will just come and have pity for us and will do the right things for us if we don't demand it. If they find you sleeping and they want to help themselves with something, they will take it and you remain sleeping. Yes, they will not wake you up. They just leave you to sleep and take what they want that they are interested in. So I really don't want to point at others as doing the wrong things. I think we are doing the wrong things ourselves. We just need to wake up and raise the right issues that will put us at the same level. So imagine Africa is home to almost all raw materials and other things required for industrialization and all sorts of things you would want to talk about. Yet you will find very few places in Africa where there is real value addition. We are still trading and exporting raw materials. For example, why should Africans who are producing cotton export it the way it is, picked from the farm and just export it like that? And people go to process it abroad and earn more money, dozen times what you are getting by just growing cotton, and then you are not able to process it. Why should it happen? It's up to Africa to demand that we should start processing, or people come and invest in the processing. And this has nothing to do with discriminating or being difficult or alienating anybody. No, it's about setting the terms as they set for doing business. So for me, however, I'm comfortable with China and India coming to Africa because we will have increased competition for what we offer, and that will give us a better price if we are not sleeping.
I have to apologize to all the young people who queued up. Several of you queued up. My apologies. But you know, the most precious resource that a president has is his time. And you've been very generous with your time. I must say you're very brave, Mr. President, to begin your remarks by quoting what the Economist said, you know. Very bluntly, as you said in your remarks, Africa is a hopeless continent. Well, I'm pleased to report that after listening to you for the last 90 minutes, I think the big message you have left behind with us is one of hope. And it's very clear that I think all of us in the room feel much more hopeful and optimistic for Africa's future. And we also appreciate very much your candor. I mean, for you to say that we must wake up. And we mustn't assume that others wake us up. And the message, constant message of self-reliance, I think is a very, very important one. We thank you very much for coming here, for sharing your wisdom with us. And before you leave, we want to convey to you a small token of appreciation. It is really very small. It is a book written by me. It's called The New Asian Hemisphere, in the hope that when you come next time, you give us a book called The New African Hemisphere. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, he put it that he had a small gift for me. But ideas are never small. So I think this is a big gift. So thank you very much.